So your immune system, immunity and all, it very important. You need this. We need this as a organism to survive, but you don't want it to be too broad or whatever. You need it to be kind of specific to what disease, either bacterial or viral or fungal or parasitic worm or rogue cells or cancerous. So when you think about immunity, it needs to be specific. There needs to be a specificity to this and such. And you need to be able to recognize the antigen. Whatever it is that's provoking this, your body needs to know that that is an invader and such. Any foreign molecule that triggers this is known as an antigen. Once seen, you need to have a memory so that the next time you see it, you will get a stronger, faster immunological response to this foreign invader. The cells responsible for this, these are your lymphocytes. And there's two main types of lymphocytes needed for this immune response, T cells and B cells. And they're named by where they mature. Everything, all red blood cells and white blood cells, blood products are produced in the red bone marrow. If they stay there until they become immunocompetent, then you say that they're B cells. If they leave and go to the thymus and then they gain their immunocompetence in the thymus, then you refer to them as T cells. And now, thinking of T cells, you have different types of T cells, and we'll just mention two of them. And we name them by the types of proteins that they will actually express on their plasma membranes. So you have this T4 or this T8. That CD means cell differentiation factor 4 and cell differentiation factor 8. But it's a lot easier to say T4 and T8. When they're there, you need them to be able to respond. And one way that they respond is through what's known as a cell-mediated immunity. And when this happens, it's because you have some intracellular pathogen. You have something within the cells. And this causes the cell to express on its outer membrane certain proteins. And these CD8 cells, they recognize this. They said, this is not supposed to be here. This is a foreign invader, this cell is. Cancer cells do this. Parasites, because of their cell membranes, they express this. Viruses get into a cell. The cell produces an interferon. And also, when the cell's machinery gets hijacked, it'll cause it to change its expression of surface proteins. And these T cells recognize that. And they attack that cell and they destroy that cell. Some cancer cells, when a cell becomes cancerous, it'll change its plasma membrane protein expression, and these T cells recognize that and they go and kill those cells as well. Another form of immunity is antibody mediated, and this is done by the B cells, and the B cells will become these plasma cells. And this works against things that are in the bodily fluids, in the lymph, in the plasma, in the lymph and the blood, or if you have them in where you have bodily fluids and such. So these are pathogens that are outside of the cells. And this is mostly this is bacteria that the antibodies work against. So anything that the body says is foreign, that's an antigen. So it could be anything. And if you have a reaction to certain things, say, well, you might be allergic to this or bothered by that. But those are antigens. Anything that your body says is foreign. Your body can turn on itself. And it can look at your bodily tissues and say, that's foreign. That's when you have serious problems. Those are your autoimmune disorders. An antigen, it has to have a couple of things going for it for our body to be able to recognize it as an antigen. It has to be able to provoke the immune response, And then it also, when we have a response, the antibody that is produced needs to be able to interact with it. You can have all the antibodies all day long, and if they don't react with the antigen is still going to keep causing the immune response and keep doing its damage. So what are things that can be considered an antigen? You can see them right there. Bacteria, the toxins produced, like I mentioned earlier, they're lipopolysaccharides produced by gram-negative bacteria like E. coli. Pollen, that happens every spring and summer. Some people are allergic to eggs, transplanted tissues, anything that the body says is a foreign invader is an antigen. So if it gets in the blood, it's going to the spleen. It'll pass through the spleen and such. And so you have in that white pulp, you have your lymphocytes and your B cells hanging out waiting to see these. If it gets in through the skin, and that's usually because you have broken the skin. Remember that. If it gets into the skin, then it'll get into the interstitial space. Then it'll get picked up by the lymphatic vessels and carried to a lymph node. Cancer cells, epidermal cancer, basal cell squamous, basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, skin cancers, if they go down, they get past that basement membrane, they can get picked up by these lymphatic vessels. If it's in your mucous membranes, anything that you eat or breathe or push in there or take your finger and put in there, then the antigen enters through the mucosa and gets into the malt and such. Now, the actual part of the antigen, the part that actually triggers the immune response is known as the epitope. Sometimes things that are not even living things or something outside of the body can be brought in and moved in and such, and they might not cause an immune response themselves, but then a protein within the body mixes with them, and then those two things together actually trigger this immune response. You have the ability to distinguish. Think about this, at birth, not even being exposed to it, you have this ability to distinguish over 1 billion different antigens. Now, as you go through life and as you're exposed to different things, if you live through it, you then gain this immunity, this response, this ability to recognize that antigen again so that you can fight it off a second time. Sometimes you'll have this memory, if you will, already, and you'll never even see that antigen in your lifetime, but you have it. So there it is. A specific type of antigen that we all have, these are these MHC, major histocompatibility. Some books refer to it as a human leukocyte antigen, an HLA. I'll always refer to them as MHCs. Everybody on their cell surfaces have these MHCs, and everybody's are a little bit different. There's the ones built into your plasma membranes, and those are your class 1s. Any cell that you have that has a nucleus has class 1s. And then the class 2 only show up on these antigen presenting cells, or these thymic cells, or these T cells and such, once they have been exposed to an antigen. So by doing this, by making these class 2s, this is how these cells present an antigen to the B cells and the T cells and all. But every cell in your body that has a nucleus has expressed on its cell membranes these class 1 proteins, these class 1 MHCs. So how does your body know that it is an antigen, that it's something that it needs to fight off? How does it recognize self from non-self? Okay. So the B and T cells have to first see this antigen and recognize it as a foreign antigen. And they really don't do that by themselves. They have to be shown this and such. B cells can, because they are part of that antibody mediated things floating in the fluids and such, they can sometimes bump into those, find those, and recognize those. But the T cells, because T cells are such a powerful cell, they have to be shown what to attack and kill. And also, these special types of white blood cells will bring these antigens in and process it, and then attach it to the MHC, and then put it on their cell surface, and then go and show it to the T cells and the B cells. And then the T cell will decide if it needs to attack that or not. So if the protein that's brought in comes from you, if it comes from a self protein after it's been processed and shown, the T cell says, not going to do it. If it's a foreign protein, then it recognizes it as foreign, and then it triggers this immune response, this T cell response and such. So this processing and presenting the antigen is what these APC cells do. And it depends upon where the antigen comes from. If it's outside of your body cells, if it's in the fluids, then it's an exogenous one. So bacteria, worm, pollen, dust, viruses, these are exogenous antigens. You have special cells, macrophages, B cells, or these dendritic cells. They're in areas like a lymph node or a lymph nodule or the spleen. And when they encounter these antigens, these exogenous antigens, they bring them in, and through phagocytosis. Once inside there, they break that protein down into peptide fragments. And at the same time, that cell is actually making MHC2 proteins. These MHC2 proteins bind and fuse with these peptide fragments, just parts of them. And then they move those to the cell membrane, and then they show it, and they express it on their cell membranes. Then they take that to a B cell or a T cell, and when they do it, they are showing it to them. They are presenting this antigen to these B cells and T cells, and then those cells have a choice to make. They can either make antibodies and attack, or they can then turn on the types of T cell and attack. If the antigen comes from within a cell, and such, like when a virus already has gotten into, or if a cell is cancerous and it's producing rogue proteins or abnormal proteins and such, fragments of that antigen will actually combine with the MHC1. And then this antigen MHC1 is then shown on the outer surface. And then it's shown or presented to these B cells and T cells. And then they have a choice to make. What do they do? Do they attack or they not attack? And such. Is this a rogue protein? Is it not? Is this a cancer cell? Is it not? And all. So, all right, let's stop right there.